At sunrise, I signed the papers that put my lakefront cabin forever out of my son-in-law's grasp, and minutes later, the fob to the downtown condo he hid from my daughter blinked red at the lobby door. My hands didn't shake. At 65, you learn to breathe when the people you fed and raised try to erase you. I didn't argue or plead. I let deeds, dates, and signatures do the talking while I watched his smile fall flat in the glass. And that was only my opening move. What followed would test every promise our family ever claimed to honor. Before I continue the story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I set the table with a care that felt old-fashioned. The oak dining table had been with me for decades, polished so many times that the surface still carried a faint glow under the ceiling light. I laid out the china plates, the ones I had kept since my wedding day, and placed cloth napkins folded into neat triangles. The roast chicken rested on its platter in the center, surrounded by rosemary sprigs I had picked from the garden. It was a small detail, but I wanted everything to look warm, to feel like home. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock in the hallway. I had imagined the sound of laughter, of footsteps racing up the stairs, as it used to be when my daughter was young. Now it was only me waiting. I told myself this dinner was just a simple gathering, but deep down, I hoped it could be something more. An evening where we remembered we were still a family, where conversation flowed as easily as the wine I had set beside the glasses. When the door finally opened, I heard the shuffle of shoes and the soft exchange of voices. My daughter Isolde stepped in first, her coat draped over one arm, followed closely by her husband Dorian. They looked every bit the young professional couple, sharp clothes, tired smiles that belonged to people carrying the weight of ambition. Mom Isolde said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. Her perfume was light citrus and floral, and for a second I was back to the days of brushing her hair before school. Dorian followed with a polite nod. "Evening, Marjorie. Smells wonderful in here." We sat around the table. At first, everything was calm. The clinking of forks, the passing of the bread basket, the small talk about traffic and work schedules filled the room. Yet underneath it all, I sensed a strain. Silences that stretched too long. Glances exchanged between Isolde and Dorian that didn't quite match the words they spoke aloud. I tried to ignore it. I told myself families carried invisible weights, and tonight wasn't the night to pry them open. I smiled, offered more potatoes, and kept the rhythm of the meal steady. Still, the air felt different, as though we were performing a play with lines rehearsed only half-heartedly. Then Dorian leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine glass as if he were about to deliver good news. His tone was smooth, too smooth, and I felt my stomach tighten, even before he spoke. "You know," he began, smiling toward me, "your cabin by the lake would make the perfect family retreat. It's quiet, spacious, exactly what Isolde and I have been needing. Somewhere we could take the kids when that time comes, a place to make memories." The words slid across the table as easily as butter, yet they cut into me like a blade. I kept my face still, but inside, something faltered. That cabin wasn't just a piece of property. It was where my late husband and I had spent summers fishing, where Isolde learned to swim, where fireflies once lit up the night sky like tiny lanterns. To hear him claim it so casually as though it were already theirs was almost surreal. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to lift a forkful of vegetables to my mouth. My silence felt heavy, but it was the only shield I had in that moment. If I spoke too quickly, the words would come out sharp, and I refused to give him that satisfaction. Isolde reached for her glass, her fingers brushing against his wrist, and then she said it, the words that stung deeper than Dorian's smooth suggestion. "Mom, it makes sense. The cabin should belong to the new family now. Dorian and I could really take care of it. Use it the way it's meant to be used. You don't go there much anymore." Her tone wasn't cruel, not outright, but it carried a finality that left no room for me. She had taken his side without hesitation, as though the memories we had built there together meant less than the future she envisioned with him. The betrayal didn't come with raised voices or slammed fists. It came quietly dressed in reason, in the kind of logic that excluded me from my own life. The room felt smaller. The only sounds were the scrape of silverware on porcelain and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I stared at my plate, at the chicken I had carved so carefully, and for the first time in years, I felt invisible at my own table. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I sat tall, gathering every ounce of dignity I had. The humiliation pressed against me like a weight, but I let it settle in silence. I memorized the moment, the look in Dorian's eyes as he pretended generosity, the quick nod of agreement from Isolde, the hollow ache in my chest. Family dinners are supposed to be places of comfort, but that night, mine became a theater where my role was no longer needed. I had been reduced to the spectator of a conversation that rewrote history in front of me. I lowered my eyes to my plate, but inside I knew something had shifted forever. The silence that followed the suggestion about my cabin was not the gentle kind that settles after a family meal. It was heavy, pressing down on my chest like a weight. Every sound seemed amplified, the scrape of a fork against porcelain, the faint chime of a spoon in a glass, even the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. I stared at the candles flickering at the center of the table, their wax slowly melting into the dish below, and I wondered if anyone else felt the air thicken. I had spent hours preparing this meal, hoping to feel surrounded by warmth, by family. Instead, I sat there, my heart pounding in a room where my voice seemed no longer welcome. I thought back to years earlier when this same table was crowded with neighborhood children, my daughter laughing with a smear of birthday cake on her cheek, my husband cutting generous slices for everyone. Those moments felt alive in the grain of the wood beneath my fingertips. Tonight, though, the table felt foreign, like a stage where I was cast as a background character in a play I once directed. I folded my hands in my lap, pressing my palm hard against my leg, as if to remind myself, I am here, I still exist. The quiet stretched until a voice arrived, not from Isolde, not from Dorian, but from the window left cracked open for fresh air. Our neighbor's words floated in light and casual, yet cruel in their effect. "You're lucky to have such a generous son-in-law," she called, half smiling in her tone, her laughter rolling into the night air. The comment pierced through me more sharply than I could have prepared for. My breath caught in my chest. Heat surged up my neck into my face until I thought it must be glowing red. I forced a smile, brittle and thin, the kind a person uses to hide a wince. "Yes," I said softly, my voice steady only by willpower. No one corrected her. No one spoke up to say, "The cabin belongs to my mother." No one acknowledged the decades I had cared for that place, painting its shutters, repairing its roof, planting flowers by the porch every spring. Instead, silence approved the neighbor's words, as though the truth had been rewritten in real time, that Dorian, by marrying into the family, had bestowed generosity upon me. I felt invisible, diminished to a woman dependent on the goodwill of someone else's husband. I wanted to push back to reclaim my truth. Instead, I lifted my glass of water and let the rim cover my trembling lips. My hand shook slightly and I prayed no one noticed. My eyes drifted to Isolde, searching her face for any sign of defense, any flicker of recognition that what had been said was wrong. But she kept her gaze on her plate, carefully cutting a small piece of chicken chewing, slowly, deliberately, avoiding mine. Her silence was not neutral, it was complicit. It was then I realized something I had long feared but had never named. Betrayal doesn't always thunder in with shouted words or slamming doors. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the choice not to speak and the decision to let a wound deepen rather than cover it. Her silence screamed louder than any insult. Every memory of raising her crowded into my mind. The nights I sat awake beside her bed, pressing a cool cloth to her fevered forehead. The mornings I worked overtime so she could have piano lessons. The afternoons I spent driving her across town for soccer games, cheering even when the team lost. All of it seemed to collapse into nothing at that moment, as though the history of sacrifice had no place at this table. The meal lurched forward in awkward fragments. Dorian filled the quiet with stories about his latest business trip, and Isolde nodded dutifully, never once glancing at me. I felt myself shrinking in my chair, though my body hadn't moved. It was as if my very presence was being erased inch by inch. When the plates were cleared, I rose to carry them into the kitchen. Neither of them offered to help. I stacked the dishes in the sink, turned on the faucet, and watched the water run hot, clouding with soap. The hiss filled the room, covering the muffled conversation from the dining room. I didn't strain to hear. Their words no longer mattered. I lingered at the sink longer than I needed to, letting the steam rise against my face. My reflection in the kitchen window looked back at me, older, lined with years of devotion, but still standing. My hands moved in rhythm, washing one plate after another, but my thoughts spun, fast and relentless. The humiliation of the neighbor's careless remark would fade, but my daughter's silence that wound would stay. In that quiet, something shifted inside me. I chose not to argue that night, not to defend myself with words they would only dismiss. Instead, I tucked the moment away, stored it like an ember. I understood that if I wanted to protect myself, if I wanted to reclaim the dignity being chipped away, I would need to act differently from now on. By the time I set the last dish on the rack to dry, the house was quiet again. Dorian had retired to the living room, Isolde trailing behind him. I stood alone in the kitchen, the scent of lemon soap lingering on my hands, the hum of the refrigerator steady and constant. For the first time in my life, I recognized that I had no ally at that table, not even the daughter I had raised with everything I had to give. That night, while washing the dishes alone, I knew their words wouldn't leave me in peace. The morning after the dinner arrived with a hush that felt too deliberate, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I woke before the sun had fully climbed, the ache of the previous night still raw. The humiliation from the neighbor's remark and my daughter's silence clung to me like a heavy coat I couldn't shake off. My hands, stiff from years of work and age, trembled as I poured coffee into my favorite mug, the one my husband once bought at a roadside shop during a trip to Tennessee. Its chipped rim pressed against my lips as I sipped slowly, the bitter warmth soothing and grounding me. The cabin greeted me with its usual silence, but that silence now carried a different weight. I wandered room to room, touching the door frames, the worn wood panels, and the curtains I had sewn decades ago. Each corner held echoes of my husband's laughter, the baritone voice that once told me, "Keep this place safe, Marjorie. It's our legacy." His words came back with sharp clarity, like a bell struck in the stillness. The thought made me pause at the staircase leading to the attic. I hadn't been up there in months, maybe years. Dust and time had buried it, but something inside me urged me to climb. I carried the mug in one hand and pushed open the narrow attic door with the other. The smell of cedar and mothballs rushed out, mixed with the faint scent of dried pine needles from the wreaths we once stored up here. The boards creaked beneath my feet as I made my way into the half-light beams of autumn sun sneaking in through the slats. It was there, tucked between the beams above a storage trunk, that I saw an envelope wedged tightly, its edges curled and yellowed with age. My heart caught. The handwriting across the front was unmistakable, my husband's bold and steady, though softened by time. My fingers shook as I pried it loose, brushing off a thin layer of dust. I slid the flap open and pulled out a stack of papers, my breath uneven as I unfolded the first sheet. They were property records, detailed precise, showing the deed to the cabin and annotations in his handwriting, notes about taxes, survey lines, and potential disputes, and then, at the bottom, a single line underlined twice: "Protect what we built." Tears welled in my eyes, blurring the words. He had known. He had anticipated that one day someone might try to challenge what was ours. This wasn't paranoia. It was foresight. The validation surged through me like fresh air after drowning. I pressed the papers to my chest and whispered, "You always knew, didn't you?" For the first time since last night, I didn't feel small. I felt seen, even by someone long gone. As I continued to shuffle through the envelope, another document slipped free. It was a signed receipt dated just last year. The ink was crisp, the letterhead from a real estate office downtown, and there, clear as day, was Dorian's name. Not tied to my cabin? No, this was for a condo sleek and expensive in the heart of Houston. My pulse quickened as I read the details, payments, signatures, closing fees. None of it had ever been mentioned by Isolde. The betrayal widened before me. It wasn't only my legacy he was circling, it was my daughter's marriage. He had secrets she didn't know, and I now held proof of them in my hands. For a moment, my anger shifted. It wasn't only about me anymore. This was about her, too. The man she trusted, the man she defended with silence last night, was hiding more than arrogance. He was hiding an entire life. The attic air grew warmer, heavier, as though the cabin itself was reacting to the discovery. I sat on the trunk papers spread around me like fragile leaves and let the weight of it settle. My mind raced with options: confront him at once, wave the receipt in his face, demand answers. But no. The thought of another dinner like last night with my words drowned out by silence stopped me. Confrontation would only give him the chance to twist the truth. Instead, I gathered each paper, carefully stacking them in order, sliding them back into the envelope as though tucking away something sacred. My hand steadied as I did it. I pressed the flap closed, slipped the envelope into my purse, and let my fingers linger there. I whispered into the empty attic, "I'll decide when the truth comes out." I stood and looked around one last time. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beams of sunlight, settling on boxes of Christmas ornaments, quilts, and old family albums. This attic had always been a place of storage of forgotten things. Now it held the future wrapped inside one man's foresight and another man's betrayal. That night, as the crickets sang outside the cabin windows and the water lapped gently at the shore, I set the envelope on the table beside my bed. I watched it under the lamplight, the worn paper holding steady. I knew it carried the power to unravel everything. Saturday mornings had always been mine. I liked the rhythm of the kettle, the hum of the refrigerator, the simple quiet of a house that had served me for decades. That morning, though, the sound of my front door opening without a knock cut right through the stillness. Dorian's voice followed smooth as polished stone, announcing their arrival as if it were his home and not mine. Isolde trailed behind him, setting her purse on the counter like she had grown up here, though she never truly had. He spoke in the plural. "We'll take the keys, we'll plan weekends, we'll manage supplies," phrases that landed like trespasses in my kitchen. I stirred sugar into my coffee, letting each clink of the spoon be my answer. They mistook my silence for consent, or maybe they didn't care. I watched the way Isolde nodded to his words, not daring to look at me. They believed ownership could be spoken into existence. I made sure my face revealed nothing binding. I poured an extra cup of coffee, set it down with calm hands, and said simply, "It's early for such plans." Inside, I wrote every word into memory. The conversation dragged into the second cup. Dorian leaned back, his smile too assured, and began outlining maintenance schedules for the cabin, speaking as if my independence were a flaw to be corrected. "You shouldn't be driving up there alone, Marjorie," he said, as if my age rendered me incapable. I held my mug steady, letting the heat warm my palms instead of my temper. "I've been driving that road longer than you've been alive," I thought, though I didn't say it. Instead, I offered a smile so precise it might have been cut from glass. I thanked him for his concern and suggested that the house needed air, so I would be leaving for errands. The words pushed them politely out the door without a scene, but the air they left behind was thick with presumption. I rinsed the mugs slowly one by one until the clatter of their car faded from my driveway. Only then did I let the corners of my mouth drop, not into despair, but into calculation. By late afternoon, I was walking up the stone steps to Arthur's office downtown. The brass plate on the door caught the light, and I found comfort in its permanence. Inside, the hush of the place was a balm. Arthur, steady as always, greeted me without surprise. He pulled out the family trust binder as if he had been waiting for me to finally open it. We sat together at the oak desk, the binder thick and full of signatures, clauses, and the quiet power of legal standing. He flipped to the section on the cabin first. His finger landed on my name sole owner, no co-signers. "This is yours, Marjorie. It cannot be claimed by anyone else." The words were a steady hand on my shoulder. Then he turned to the downtown condo, Dorian's name appearing on receipts logs and homeowners' notices. Arthur explained the trustee rights I held, what documents I could request, how the law drew boundaries that Dorian could not erase with charm or audacity. I listened carefully, jotting down every phrase that mattered. My questions were precise: what could be disclosed, what must be preserved, how silence could be a strategy, not a weakness. The relief was sharp, but so was the resolve that followed it. I wasn't imagining the danger they had already stepped too far. Now I held the proof tucked between pages stamped with authority. When I left the office, the sky was washed with late-day light. I tucked the binder into my tote heavier than it looked and stepped into the quiet hum of the city. I did not feel like a woman erased. I felt like a woman preparing. Confrontation would come, but not in their time, not on their terms. I tightened my grip on the handle of my bag. The cabin, the condo, the paper trail, each piece was falling into place. I whispered to myself as I walked toward the parking lot, I don't need permission to protect what I built. By Thanksgiving, they would learn that silence isn't surrender, it's preparation. The drive to Isolde's house was lined with maple trees already stripped by November winds. Houston doesn't give you the postcard autumn of the Northeast, but the air carried a crispness that made me think of years past, of turkeys roasted in my own oven, of laughter that used to rise from my dining room. This year, I was simply a guest summoned rather than invited. When I stepped through the door, conversation around the living room dropped by half a note. It wasn't silence exactly, but a hollow pause, as though my presence reminded everyone of something they'd rather ignore. I smiled, my chin lifted, and offered my pumpkin pie to Isolde. She took it without a word of thanks, whisking it toward the crowded counter, where pies, casseroles, and cranberry jars already competed for space. At the dining table, I found my seat waiting at the far end, not near the children's table, but close enough to feel like overflow. The extra chair slightly different from the rest, its cushion thinner, its back shorter. I slid into it without complaint, noting how eyes darted back to conversations that excluded me. I smoothed my napkin across my lap. I reminded myself dignity isn't in where they place you, but in how you sit there. Dinner began with the usual shuffle of plates and silverware. Carved turkey passed down the table, steam rising from green beans, slicked with butter, sweet potatoes, ringed with marshmallows. For a while, I let the rhythm of clinking forks and murmured grace carry me along. Halfway through the meal, I cleared my throat gently. "I remember when your father built the cabin," I said, looking toward my daughter. He insisted on hammering every beam himself, even though Isolde cut in before I finished. "Oh, Mom, you always get those stories mixed up." She laughed lightly, but the sound was sharp. It was Uncle Peter who hammered most of the beams. "You must be forgetting again." A chuckle ran down the table. It wasn't cruel in volume, but it stung more for being casual, like brushing crumbs from a shirt. Dorian reached across, laying his hand on mine with the smoothness of a man delivering a performance. "Don't worry, Marjorie," he said, smile practiced. "Just relax. You don't need to carry all those old memories. We'll take care of the future." I felt the heat creep up my neck. I returned his touch with a polite smile, though my hand stiffened beneath his. Inside, the words carved lines across my heart, confused, forgetting, relax. They wanted me small, manageable, tucked away like the pie cooling in a corner. I took a slow sip of water. Let them think I'd swallowed my pride with it. Later, As the plates emptied and the wine glasses refilled, Dorian leaned back in his chair, voice pitched just loud enough to reach both ends of the table. "We're planning a family retreat this summer," he said. "The cabin will be perfect. Plenty of space for the kids. The lake right there. It's already settled." Heads turned down the table. A cousin raised an eyebrow. Someone murmured, "That's generous," as though the deed had already shifted hands. Isolde added her chorus, her tone firm. "Mom's not up for handling it alone anymore. It makes sense for us to manage it. For the whole family's benefit, of course." Her words landed heavier than Dorian's. To hear my daughter pronounce me unfit to see her align herself so smoothly with him, it hollowed the room in a way even silence couldn't. I lifted my wine glass. The rim trembled against my lips, but I didn't spill. Instead of answering, I let the Merlot fill my mouth, bitter and warm, anchoring me. I kept my gaze steady on the candle at the table's center. Its flame flickered thin but unextinguished. Around me, the conversation picked up again, redirected toward holiday sales and football scores. Yet I felt the echo of their claim pulse in my ears, louder than any cheer from the television in the next room. They thought they had announced my surrender. All they had done was mark their arrogance in public ink. When dessert was served, I excused myself early. "It's been a long day," I said, folding my napkin with deliberate calm. "I'll let you all enjoy the rest of the evening." Polite nods followed me to the door, relief thinly veiled. Outside, the night air wrapped me in cool silence. I pulled my coat tighter and walked slowly to my car, each step steadier than the last. They believed their performance had humiliated me. They thought the family's laughter was a knife sharp enough to cut away my place. But knives dull. Silence, when honed carefully, can slice deeper than they ever imagine. As I turned the key in the ignition, I promised myself I would not raise my voice, nor would I beg. My silence would grow gather and strike at the moment they least expected. They mistook my quiet departure as surrender. They had no idea I was walking straight toward their secrets. Monday morning in downtown Houston carried a different kind of chill than the Thanksgiving night I'd just endured. The courthouse blocks always seemed to hum with fluorescent light and quiet urgency, as though every soul inside was trying to carry secrets without letting them slip. I parked 2 streets over and walked in, with a leather purse tucked beneath my arm, the same one I'd carried since my husband was alive. That purse had held recipes, grocery lists, birthday cards. Today it held only a pen, a notepad, and the weight of suspicion. The county records office smelled faintly of toner and floor polish. Rows of filing cabinets stood like sentinels from another era, though most of the real work happened on glowing screens behind the counter. I stepped up and asked for condo ownership records tied to Dorian's name. My voice didn't shake. I knew exactly what I was asking for, even if my heart pounded. The clerk, a young man with glasses too large for his narrow face, paused, fingers hovering above his keyboard. He glanced at me with an expression halfway between curiosity and disapproval, the kind reserved for people digging into matters that weren't supposed to concern them. "What exactly are you looking for, ma'am?" he asked. "Any active properties," I said evenly, "particularly downtown, under the name Dorian Blackwell. Check variations, middle initials, maiden names attached." He raised an eyebrow, then turned to his monitor. The hum of the printer grew louder in the silence. After a few minutes, he slid several pages across the counter. "These are public records," he said. "But you didn't hear the overdue fees from me." His lips twitched, almost conspiratorial. I studied the notices. Homeowners Association dues unpaid for 2 months. A lien filed quietly, not yet escalated, but looming. My pulse quickened. Secrets rarely come clean. They bleed out. The second batch of papers arrived with the sting I had half expected and half dreaded. There it was, in black ink, a deed signed by Dorian, but beside his signature, another name appeared, Isolde's maiden name, as if she had co-signed without co-signing. A legal trick, a veneer of deniability. I held the page steady even as my chest tightened. To see my daughter's name, the one I gave her used like camouflage, it cut deeper than the betrayal itself. I thought of the girl who once slipped her hand into mine on the first day of school, begging me not to let go. That same name now sat beside her husband's, sheltering his secret. I ordered certified copies. The clerk stamped them methodically, each thud of the seal echoing through the room like a gavel. "You'll want these for any disputes," he said. "Yes," I murmured, folding them neatly into a manila envelope. Disputes have a way of arriving on their own. Walking out of that office, I felt both hollow and strangely fortified. It was no longer suspicion. It was proof. Back home, I spread the papers across my dining table, the same table where I once taught Isolde to balance a checkbook. I fetched the old box of financial records from the cabinet and began cross-referencing dates. It didn't take long before the trail lit up like a neon sign. Payments for the condo's mortgage didn't come from Dorian alone. Several installments had been drawn from the joint family account, the one Isolde once controlled, when she helped me manage bills after her father passed. The withdrawals were disguised among legitimate expenses, medical insurance, property taxes, household maintenance. But the amounts when lined up against the condo ledger matched too neatly to ignore. I felt a rush of outrage, hot and undeniable. They hadn't just plotted to take the cabin. They had siphoned from me, from what my husband and I built. Their luxury, whatever high-rise glass tower they had been hiding, was funded by my trust. My pen scratched furiously across the margins, circling numbers, underlining dates. Each mark steadied me, turned anger into clarity. Evening fell, and my living room dimmed except for the glow of the lamp beside me. I laid out the documents as though preparing for battle. Certified copies stacked neatly, notes scribbled, evidence undeniable. The house was silent, but the truth was deafening. I could almost hear my husband's voice, the way he used to say, "Paper is heavier than stone when it carries proof." I whispered into the still air, "They'll hang themselves with the rope they braided." The words didn't sound cruel. They sounded final, inevitable. I slid the envelope into my purse, zipped it shut, and leaned back in my chair. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, but inside I was steady. Thanksgiving had humiliated me. Christmas would not. The next family gathering would not be a dinner. It would be a battlefield dressed in holiday lights. The December air in Houston didn't bite the way it does up north, but a damp chill still slid under my coat as I climbed the porch steps with a paper bag of wrapped gifts. Isolde and Dorian had draped the eaves in white lights. A pair of inflatable reindeer nodded at the street. Through the door, I heard laughter, the clink of glasses, Sinatra on a playlist. I pressed the bell and let my shoulders settle before the show began. Warm air rushed out with spice and pine. Little feet skittered across hardwood as the grandchildren orbited the tree. I kissed cheeks handed gifts and hung my coat on the same brass hook I'd installed in their first apartment a lifetime ago. From the threshold, I watched Dorian moving room to room, placing himself at the hub of every conversation, steering attention with a hand on a shoulder, a laugh that lasted one beat too long. When eyes drifted toward me, he introduced a new topic, and the circle turned back to him, a merry-go-round that never stopped at my horse. I found the kitchen, asked where I could help, and took up the easy jobs, buttering rolls, refilling ice, rinsing a bowl when the sink opened up. The tree blinked in the corner of my eye, a polite metronome. I breathed in cinnamon and remembered a different December, the year Isolde was 8, and we strung popcorn and cranberries until our fingers pricked. She had worn a paper crown she'd cut from a grocery bag. "We made this," she'd said then. Tonight, she looked like a woman who didn't have time for glue or needles-only outcomes. Dinner spread across the dining table, ham glazed dark as lacquer green beans with almonds rolls brushed with butter until they shone. I helped plate the children, poured water, and took my seat at the far end close to the sideboard and its army of serving spoons. Holiday warmth wrapped the room. Inside my chest, it landed as a careful nostalgia, something I could put down quickly if needed. Midway through the meal, Dorian rose and tapped his glass. Forks stopped. Conversations thinned. Isolde stood beside him. Chin lifted, a woman polishing a picture in her mind. A toast, he said, to resilience, to weathering storms as a family, and to new leadership, those of us ready to take care of our family retreat for the generations ahead. The words arrived sugared and sharp, a ribbon around a blade. Isolde's glass met his with the clean note of crystal. Around the table, others followed, clinking, smiling too hard. I lifted my own glass, let the wine touch my lips, then set it down. The heat that rose in me wasn't from the Cabernet. It was the old, steady burn of being told you're obsolete while the room applauds. No one noticed my hands slide to my lap and fold. From there, I could feel my pulse without anyone seeing my face. After dinner, the house fractured into Little Constellation's card game at the Kitchen Island football, murmuring from the den, children negotiating trades of candy canes. I wrapped leftovers in foil, lined them in tidy rows, and kept breathing. One of the kids, 7, maybe, skated in sock feet to the fridge and announced to a cousin too loud for the room he was in, "Daddy says the condo is bigger than Grandma's cabin." Silence swept the doorway like a draft. Dorian gave a chuckle that rattled a little, then put on his friendly voice. "Kids mix things up," he said, waving a hand as if erasing chalk. Isolde laughed lightly, eyes a shade too bright. The cousins were herded toward a movie. The den doors whispered shut. I didn't move. I just met their eyes and held the look long enough for the truth to land. Dorian blinked first. I rinsed the carving knife, set it to dry, and folded the dish towel until the edge aligned perfectly with the counter. They wanted me to flare to embarrass myself so their story could harden around my outburst. Instead, I arranged rolls in a tin, wrote a label for tomorrow, and let quiet be my witness. When the tree called the children back, I slipped into the living room and stood close enough to see my reflection in a red ornament. My face looked like my mother's on the Christmas she learned to stop hoping people would be other than themselves. From my purse, I took a small glass bauble, etched with my initials, ML. I placed it low near the trunk where only the person who undecorates will find it. A reminder isn't a threat. It is a truth with a hook to hang on. At the door, I hugged the grandchildren, thanked Isolde for the meal, and told Dorian the prime rib was done exactly right. My coat felt heavier on my shoulders than when I'd arrived, but my steps to the car were light. Outside, the wind had turned. You can hear change in the trees if you've lived long enough with them. All the way home, Sinatra gave way to silence, and in that silence, I counted my proofs. Certified copies in my purse, dates that matched like teeth, bank lines that would not tolerate euphemism. I sat a moment in the dim car and pictured the ornament glinting in their room like a small, patient clock. The season had taught me many things. The most useful was that light doesn't only show what's pretty, it reveals where the cracks already are. By New Year's, the glitter would be gone. Lies rarely survive cleanup. What remains after the tinsel is the shape of what we've built, and I intend to keep what I built standing. On my street, the lawns were decked out plastic angels, wire deer, a nativity missing one wise man. A neighbor waved from her driveway's cigarette ember, winking like a tiny beacon. I waved back and kept walking, the purse tucked close beneath my coat. Some nights resolve shows as quiet routine, setting the kettle lining documents by date, writing a single name on a yellow tab and pressing it flat. I am not hunting a fight. I am drawing a map. When the path is clear enough, even those who pretend not to see it must walk it. The last day of December carried a kind of damp chill unique to Houston. It wasn't the deep cold of the northern states, but a sticky heaviness that clung to my coat as I walked up the sidewalk toward my cousin's house. The whole block glimmered with Christmas lights still strung across porches, but the brightest glow came from her windows, spilling yellow warmth into the night. Music pulsed through the walls, mingled with laughter, and the smell of barbecue carried across the lawn. I paused before stepping inside, bracing myself. I knew this evening wouldn't be about celebration alone. Inside the house buzzed with festivity. Relatives crowded the living room, their voices overlapping in noisy cheer. Streamers draped over ceiling fans, balloons floated lazily above heads, and the buffet table sagged under the weight of brisket tamales and too many desserts. I added my pecan pie to the lineup, smiling politely at a cousin who barely looked up from her phone. Conversation slowed when I entered, then started again a little too quickly. I noticed it all: the sideways glances, the slight hush, the way my daughter Isolde avoided my eyes by fussing with the punch bowl. Dorian, on the other hand, was louder than ever. His laugh rang across the room, too sharp, too rehearsed. He moved like a man on stage, clapping shoulders, topping off glasses, leaning too close to relatives, as though charm could disguise the cracks beneath him. I watched him from a quiet corner, my own glass untouched, thinking of the folder hidden in my purse. Proof didn't require performance. Proof waited patiently until the right stage opened. As midnight neared, music softened and everyone drifted into the living room for the countdown. Champagne bottles popped, glasses rose. Dorian climbed onto the hearthstone, flushed from drink, waving his glass high like he was leading a charge. He started strong, to family. He declared, his voice steady despite the wobble in his stance. To resilience, to building a future together. People cheered. But then, with a grin too wide, he added, "And to our condo downtown, our real home away from home." The words cut the room in half. Silence fell sharp enough to hear the clock tick. A few cousins glanced at me uncertain while others looked down into their glasses. Music sputtered back on laughter, forced itself through the air, but the damage had landed. Isolde's face went pale. Her smile stretched thin, brittle, as glass about to shatter. She tugged on Dorian's sleeve as though she could pull the sentence back into his throat. But truth doesn't retreat once spoken. It lingers, echoing louder than fireworks. I slipped away into the kitchen, letting the noise cover my retreat. From my purse, I drew out the manila folder Arthur had delivered days earlier. Certified bank statements notarized records lines of ink that didn't lie. Each page was cold, precise, undeniable. Transfers routed through accounts once tied to my daughter, payments timed perfectly with the condo's fees, Dorian's signature curling at the bottom like a careless flourish. I spread them across the counter, studying every figure. Betrayal in black and white. For years they had treated me like a relic, a fading voice at the table. But here, in neat columns and stamped seals, was the proof that my silence had never been ignorance. They thought they'd hidden their indulgence, their secret home in the city, their siphoned money. Yet every dollar left a trail, and I held it in my hands. Voices from the living room rose 10-9-8. The countdown thundered through the house. I set the pages back into the folder, sliding it into my purse with deliberate care. My hands didn't shake. My heart was steady, like it had finally found its rhythm. 7-6-5. Cheers grew louder. Glasses clinked. Fireworks cracked outside their sparks, reflecting off the window as I stepped closer, the documents pressed to my chest. 4-3-2-1. The room erupted. Happy New Year. Confetti sprayed, couples kissed, children shrieked with delight. Fireworks lit the night sky in bursts of red and gold. I stood apart, watching the sparks fade into smoke. Their joy washed over me without touching me. I whispered to the glass, to the night beyond. The year they mocked me will be the year they answer for it. My breath fogged the pain, but my voice was calm, resolute. I wasn't a woman broken by humiliation. I was a woman holding evidence, waiting for the right moment to strike. I turned back toward the crowd, forcing a smile that no one questioned. To them, I looked like I had finally loosened, maybe even surrendered to the holiday cheer. But inside, I was already walking forward into January. Toward the courthouse, toward signatures that mattered, toward reclaiming what they had tried to erase. The music swelled again, the champagne kept flowing, but my mind was elsewhere. I pictured my name bold and untouchable, printed across every document that mattered. They thought they had written me out of the story. Soon they would learn I was the author all along. By the first week of January, I would put my name back where they erased it on every document that mattered. Arthur called before the birds. My phone rattled on the nightstand, and for a beat I thought it was whined off the lake. "Buyers ready," he said, voice clear as January air. "All cash off market. We keep this quiet. You e-sign now, we ink the rest before noon." I pushed the curtains aside. The water was graphite turning silver. Coffee dripped. I opened the file he sent and followed the blue arrows through every clause. No contingencies, short fuse a closing that would outrun gossip. I read each line twice and signed my name where the page asked for it. Before sunrise, I walked the shoreline with one old key in my pocket, not leverage, a keepsake. Boot prints from night fishermen dotted the sand. Reeds hissed like they were keeping confidences. Memories stay, I told the flat water. The deed won't. I locked the back door, pressed my palm once to the cool pine table, and let the past sit where it belonged, behind me, not above me. By first light, Calder's agent slid an under-contract sign into the soil near the mailbox. A neighbor in a robe slowed, staring over a travel mug. She didn't wave. She eased forward 20 feet, and I saw her thumbs going on the steering wheel. News has legs in lake towns. Rumor has wings. I made a last lap through the rooms. Cabinets, wiped linens, folded the little blue bowl by the door, holding a smooth stone. Our grandkids once pocketed and put back. Heat off, trash out. Door closed without a bang. The lock caught and the key in my coat felt heavy with the weight I wouldn't carry anymore. On Highway 190, the lake fell behind, bright and merciless. Arthur called while I fueled up at a Chevron. Escrow opened. Wire ready. Instructions on the statement, he said. "Send me the confirmation," I answered. "And Arthur, thank you for drawing the map before I asked for it." "You drew it," he said. "I'm just pointing to the roads." Late morning found me across from a glass tower downtown, the kind that pretends the sun belongs to it. Through the window, I saw slate floor orchids, a concierge in navy. Calder had already handled the dull, important things, trustee documents logged with the HOA authorized signers, updated access lists, corrected in the system. At 10:22, Dorian's car cut to the curb like habit. He straightened his coat and walked in with a man who expects doors to know his name. His fob blinked red. He tried again. Red. He pressed harder as if pressure changed policy. Red. The concierge slid a laminated notice across the desk and tapped a line with a pen. Dorian read, blinked, and color drained. He dialed Isolde, put her on speaker, and his voice jumped from coaxing to sharp. "Tell your mother to fix this," he said to my daughter, as if I were a hinge to be oiled. He turned toward the glass and saw me across the street. I stayed in my car, hands quiet on the wheel. We looked at each other through noon glare. I didn't wave. I didn't move. He tried a smile he saves for waiters and juries. It slid off me. "You can't lock me out," he told the desk. The concierge inclined his head toward the printed words, "Trust Administration in effect." Contact listed party for access. He tried calling Calder next, stabbing the keypad with one furious finger. Whatever he heard didn't help. His shoulders sagged, then squared. He leaned toward the counter, voice lowered for intimidation. But the lobby is public. Power evaporates under fluorescent honesty. A dog walker paused outside. Dorian faced the glass again as if he could will me inside. I kept breathing slow, and even the way nurses taught me when my husband was sick. He mouthed a word I couldn't read. For a beat, I saw the boy he might have been. Then his face hardened and the man he is returned like a door shutting. By noon, my phone was full of texts. "Mom, what's happening? Dorian says there's a mistake. Please answer." I let them stack while I drove home down I-45, the skyline shrinking into haze. I stopped for Lemon's coffee and a small bunch of tulips to put a different red on my table. In the driveway, I answered once, "Come to Sunday brunch. Bring your questions." Arthur reserved a quiet room at a place that still irons its tablecloths and asked the manager for a door that closes. He promised folders tabbed and clean trust excerpts, HOA ledgers, bank trails, fob logs, purchase and sale agreements. That evening, I cleared my kitchen table and built 2 stacks. One for truth nothing withheld, one for mercy in case my daughter reached for accountability instead of excuses. I labeled each plainly and ran my finger along the paper the way you test a blade. Outside, a north wind shook the live oak, and the house answered with a soft frame creak. I brewed tea and stood at the window until steam blurred the yard into watercolor. My phone trilled again. "Mom, please," I typed the only boundary I could live with Sunday. Noon. Private room. We'll let the papers talk. Before bed, I took the old cabin key from my pocket and slid it into a teacup on the bookshelf. It made a small sound like a coin in a plate, enough to mark a promise I intended to keep. I turned the deadbolt a small twist, an old ritual, and set the tulips beneath a lamp. The blooms opened their red mouths to the warm light. I slid the folders into my tote and rested my hand on the handle until my pulse matched its stillness. On Sunday, I would serve the only course that never spoils documentation. The hostess guided us past clinking glasses and Sunday chatter to a private room under Arthur's name. Sunlight washed the table. I took the seat at the head and set down 3 folders, cabin condo accounts, stacked with the neatness that calms my hands when my heart won't be calmed. Isolde hovered in the doorway, then sat fingers worrying her sleeve like years ago with a loose tooth. Dorian arrived last cologne, first grin polished. He leaned back as if a photograph were being taken. Arthur set his briefcase by his feet and folded into the quiet. "One rule," I said, "we'll speak one at a time. When memory disagrees, the paper will do the talking." The room clicked into a hush. I slid the first folder to the middle and opened it. The crisp snap of the clip was the only applause I needed. "Cabin," I said. "Purchase agreement." Title officer's email with timestamps. Wire instructions with my name. The cabin at Lake Livingston Mine, to keep mine to let go, was under contract by dawn. A neighbor had seen the sign and texted half the cove. I would miss the smell of pine in July, the minnows skipping along the dock. I would not miss carrying a key for people who called my home their retreat. "That can't be right," Dorian said, reaching for bluster he hadn't earned. "It's done," I answered. I stopped mistaking sentiment for safety. I slid the second folder forward. Condo, HOA warnings, access logs, a chain of instruments tying a downtown address to Dorian's signature and to a trust I administer. I sold both. I said each word seated like a stone. Color left his face in careful stages, as if pride were an iceberg and I had just changed the temperature. "You can't sell what isn't yours. It was never yours," I said. "And I am the trustee." Isolde leaned in, reading like someone who discovers the last chapter had been missing from her copy. Her lips parted. Behind the door came a laugh and a spoon tapping a rim. Inside, the silence set like resin. She whispered, "Mom." But the sentence could not carry its weight. I let the quiet stand. When people rehearse their lines for months, silence is the only way to bump them off script. Arthur opened the accounts folder and read in a voice that had escorted 1,000 bad ideas to their consequences. Itemized arrears owed to the HOA, notices of impending liens, fob deactivations with times and dates, transfers routed from accounts Isolde once jointly managed. Numbers that traced a private lifestyle paid for with public money, the family's money wearing the costume of business expenses. Dorian tried a smile, then a scoff, then a shrug. "Leverage," he said. "A temporary strategy. Everyone does it." "The ledger says otherwise," Arthur replied. He placed a page before each of them. "The dates are not theories." Isolde stared at the line using her maiden name as if the words were a bruise appearing in real time. A quiet tear stained the margin and dried quickly. I gathered the folders one by one, closing each with care. "This isn't revenge," I said. "It's housekeeping. I am cleaning my own doorstep." Dorian looked at me as if he had reached the end of the hall and found no door to push. "What do you expect now?" "Consequences," I said, "and choices." I laid 3 napkins on the table and set a butter knife on each like paperweights. Under the first, I tucked copies of the buyer's confirmation for the cabin. Under the second, the HOA ledger and fob logs. Under the third, a short letter I had written last night to my daughter, not to her husband. I didn't slide them across. I let them sit with the patient authority of weather. The server knocked and asked if we wanted coffee. Yes, I said. I needed something ordinary to land on my tongue. He poured. Cinnamon drifted in. Arthur closed his briefcase. "We're finished," he said gently. But we were not. Not yet. Isolde lifted her eyes. "If what you've shown is true, and I can see that it is what happens next, you call the bank," I said. "Protect yourself. Tell the truth to yourself first. Then we decide what truth the family needs." Dorian pushed back his chair with a scrape that made the server flinch outside the door. He stood, then sat, then finally understood that the room had no angle left to exploit. I placed my palm flat on the folders. "I sold both," I repeated softer. "Not to punish you, but to stop feeding what hurts me." No one moved. Outside, the brunch crowd swelled and ebbed like a tide. Inside, a marriage took inventory of itself. Arthur rose. "Shall I settle the check?" I invited them, I said. "I'll pay." Dorian cleared his throat as if an apology were a coin too large for the slot. None came. Isolde nodded once, a small bow to the truth, and gathered her coat. I stood last. The chair legs whispered against the floor. I tucked the folders into my tote and felt their settled weight, the weight of decisions made in daylight, not in whispers. At the door, Isolde paused. "Mom," she said, voice thin but intact, "will you talk with me tomorrow, alone?" "Yes," I answered. "On the church steps. Bring your questions." She blinked a thank you. She could not yet speak, and then they were gone. Down the hall, the woman I raised walking beside the man who believed a mother's house was just another prize. I stayed until the room remembered how to breathe. Then I walked out into the noon sun past couples sharing pancakes and grandparents splitting omelets past the hostess with the soft bistro smile. I nodded to her and stepped into the day that was mine again. This is not revenge, I told myself as I crossed the parking lot. It is record-keeping. It is boundary-making. It is the steady, ordinary courage of a woman who finally decided to stop paying for other people's stories with her life. On the sidewalk, the January sun bounced off windshields, and the smell of coffee followed me to the curb. A mother and toddler laughed at bubbles from a street performer. One burst on my sleeve and left a bright circle of water. I brushed it away and smiled. Circles close, lines are drawn, some doors stay locked for good. Clear no. The church bell hadn't rung yet when I saw my daughter waiting on the stone steps. Her eyes were red and puffy, the kind that don't come from a bad night's sleep but from crying until you can't anymore. She kept rubbing her sleeve across her face, trying to hide the evidence, but the morning light told the truth. "Mom," she said softly, as if speaking any louder might crack her in two. "I don't want the performance. I just want the truth." I nodded once, feeling the grit of the stone beneath my shoes, the cool January air settling on my shoulders. "Then we'll go inside. But one rule: when I speak, you listen all the way through. When you speak, I'll do the same." She agreed, and we slipped into the quiet sanctuary. The wooden pews creaked gently beneath our weight, and I could almost hear the prayers left behind by others who had sat where we now did. I opened my tote bag and drew out the papers. No speeches, no accusations, just dates, signatures, and ledgers. I laid them in front of her. "These are HOA ledgers," I said, evenly sliding the first stack. "These are the access logs from the condo building. And these I placed, the last folder, gently, are the signatures tying it together." Isolde's hand shook as she flipped through the pages. She lingered on the dates that matched Dorian's so-called business trips. She frowned when she saw the withdrawals that had drained what was meant for savings. I didn't point it out. She connected the dots herself. Her lips trembled. I didn't want to see it. I breathed in slowly. Wanting peace isn't the same as choosing blindness. She looked at me. then the woman I raised suddenly visible beneath the years of being pulled and molded by someone else. Is there a way to make restitution to you? And to myself, before I could answer, footsteps echoed softly on the stone floor. Selena the pastor entered carrying the stillness of someone used to listening. She didn't intrude, only asked if we'd like the community room for privacy. We nodded and she guided us gently down the hall. In the smaller room, light filtered through frosted glass. Celine closed the door and sat with us, folding her hands. "Truth must be honored," she said quietly, "not to humiliate but to protect." She outlined practical steps with a calm firmness. Separate finances, immediately establish safety measures in case Dorian escalated, and seek counseling to untangle the knots he'd tied. She looked first at me. "You've carried too much in silence." Then at my daughter. "Owning the harm is not the same as being the harm." I felt my chest loosen. For the first time in months, maybe years, my breathing didn't feel like labor. I turned to Isolde. "Here are my conditions if I'm to stand with you. Pause all joint accounts today. Meet Arthur tomorrow. Never again weaponize my age or memory. And no contact with him without a third party present until the legal matters stabilize." Her chin quivered, but she nodded. Selene, practical as ever, drafted a simple acknowledgement. Just a page, but enough the steps, the signatures, the agreement. We both signed, the ink anchoring what words alone could not. I texted Arthur and secured a morning slot for her. She agreed to go, and she agreed to let a church volunteer accompany her when she gathered her personal belongings from the condo. When it was done, Celine suggested a prayer. There were no grand speeches, just silence, a few tears, and the sound of our breathing evening out. For the first time, I felt that maybe this wasn't the end of everything. It was the start of something that could still be saved. That evening, as candles flickered in the nave, I stayed behind. Selene joined me, her hand finding my shoulder without a word. She didn't need to say anything. I understood. Starting over wasn't a theory anymore. It was something I could feel. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and old paper, the kind of scent that clings to a building that has seen too many reckonings. I carried my tote close, Arthur walking beside me with the briefcase that held every document I had preserved. My shoes clicked softly on the marble floors, each step a reminder that I had not come here to beg, I had come here to protect what was mine. Selene was already seated in the gallery when I entered the courtroom. She gave me a nod that felt like a hand on my shoulder. I drew in a deep breath and let it out, slowly steadying myself. My daughter, Isolde, slipped into the row just behind me. She didn't sit beside Dorian, who arrived moments later with his lawyer in tow. His usual swagger was dulled, his tie knotted too tightly, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape that didn't exist. The judge entered robe, sweeping voice commanding silence. Papers shuffled, murmurs fell away. My pulse slowed, not quickened. I had done my part. Now the truth in black and white would do the rest. Arthur rose first, his voice calm, every syllable measured. He presented the cabin's clean sale contract, stamped and time-marked. Then he laid out the trust documents highlighting Dorian's misuse of Isolde's maiden name to purchase the condo. Exhibits were numbered, signatures compared. The judge leaned forward, spectacles perched on the edge of his nose, tapping each page before asking pointed questions. Dorian shifted in his chair. His lawyer tried to spin a tale of family arrangements and misunderstood intentions, but the paper trail was unrelenting. HOA arrears, late fees, forged authorizations, all pointing back to him. The judge asked him to explain his own handwriting. Dorian stammered, wiped his brow, and muttered about business strategy. The judge cut him off, sharply reminding him this was not a boardroom, but a court of law. The gavel came down with a finality that sent a shiver through the air. The assets revert to the trust. Liens enforced against Dorian Whitmore, personally. The sale of the cabin is confirmed as valid. Gasps rippled across the gallery. I kept my head high, my face calm, but inside a weight I had carried for months began to shift. Dorian's head dropped, shoulders sagging as though even he had finally heard what the rest of us already knew. When the judge asked if either side wished to make a final statement, I stood. My knees did not tremble. My voice did not waver. This was never about punishment. I said, my eyes sweeping the room but landing on my daughter. It was about respect. I built a life that deserved protection. I will not apologize for guarding it. I turned slightly toward Isolde. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but she did not look away. You still have choices, I told her, but you will never use me as your excuse again. Silence followed, heavy but cleansing. Selene gave a small nod from the gallery, her presence a quiet benediction. Isolde lowered her head, a tear rolling unchecked down her cheek. Dorian shifted in his seat but said nothing. For once, he had no words that could undo the truth. The judge adjourned. Papers were gathered, chairs scraped, and the echo of footsteps filled the hall. Yet I lingered a moment longer, letting the emptiness of the courtroom wash over me. It was not triumph I felt, but vindication, an end to a season of silence and dismissal. That evening, back at my kitchen table, I lit 2 candles and spread a fresh ledger book across the wood grain. The same table had once been littered with documents of debts, lies, and shame. Tonight it held only light. I drew 3 columns with my pen. At the top of the first, I wrote what I lost. I listed the cabin, the months of peace, the trust I once had in my daughter's judgment. The second column I titled, What I Saved. I wrote down my name, the integrity of the trust, and the truth that had finally been spoken in a place where it could not be ignored. The third column read, What I Still Have. My hand steadied as I wrote my strength, my voice, my peace. I leaned back in my chair, the candlelight flickering across the page. For months I had feared they would take everything from me, but here I sat, ledger-balanced life my own again. I closed the book gently, hands folded on top. I thought they had taken everything I whispered into the quiet room, but in the end I kept the one thing they could never steal, my voice. Looking back, I see that the greatest strength I carried was not in property or papers, but in my own voice. Protecting what we build, whether it's a home, a family, or our dignity, is not selfish, it's necessary. We cannot let silence erase us, nor let fear dictate the legacy we leave. My hope is that you take from my story the courage to stand firm in your truth, even when those closest to you turn away. Now I want to hear from you. What lessons have you learned about setting boundaries in your own life? Do you believe silence can sometimes be stronger than confrontation? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to know where you're watching from. If this story touched your heart, type the number 1 in the comments, and if you didn't enjoy it, tell me why. And please don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you won't miss the next story we share together.